Hi guys, welcome to On the DL. This is episode 18. Today we have a special guest and we're going to be covering mindfulness with Magdalena.
All over it. Now, the beautiful Miss Magdalena has been a friend and a client of mine for quite some time now. She is the founder and principal psychologist of Curious Mind Psychology. I think it's over in Footscray, isn't it, Lena?
Yep, you got it.
Yep, we're all over this. So Magdalena, would you like to tell us a little bit about your approach to psychology before we jump into a few questions for our watchers?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
We're really grateful to have you on.
Where to start with my approach to psychology? I'm a psychologist in private practice, and by trade, I'm technically something called a counseling psychologist. So what that means is I pay attention to the beliefs, context, relationship processes, and developmental experiences that play into our mental health and our well-being, how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to the people around us per se. So it's not really an emphasis on pathology, but rather what has happened to you that you might be experiencing, a sense of stuckness, or you might be struggling somewhat in your life. And we really just try to get to the bottom of those processes together, not from like an expert client sort of position, but really collaboratively. And I suppose working in private practice, I'm really about the individual rather than population level statistics. No broad sweeping brushes. We really focus on your unique constellation of factors and what's relevant for you.
Yeah, I think people love just sometimes we feel lost in the crowd these days, don't we? And we kind of want to be categorized because it feels like it might be easier to be categorized. But at the end of the day, everyone's individual experiences are so different. And if you don't take it from that individual level, you're probably not going to get to a point of resolution or where you can manage things better for yourself. Hey.
Definitely. I think that, focusing on the bigger picture can sometimes be a really convenient way to miss really deeply understanding ourselves and what's going on in our lives.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Now, Dak, I think you've got our first kick-off question for the beautiful Lena.
Long list of questions here. Complex questions. No. Obviously, unfortunately, the pandemic is quite it's everywhere. And it's affecting people's lives in different ways, some positive and some negative. And I wanted to touch on why you think, and your understanding of it, why we're kind of more inclined to take the instant gratification approach in regards to, food items or just things that have a negative effect on, whether we have a goal in the future or more so how we feel in this moment.
Yeah, great question. Maybe we can start with a bit of information about how the nervous system works and how we regulate our emotions. And then we can think about maybe more individual approaches to figuring out what's going on for you if you're making these types of decisions. But I suppose, COVID-19, this pandemic, a global trauma that it is, it's going to increase something called our allostatic load. And what that means is the chronic buildup of stress on the body and the wear and tear that exerts. So allostatic load, whatever you were dealing with before the pandemic, now it's supremely magnified. The weight's doubled, if not tripled. And it really reduces our resilience. So as our allostatic load increases, resilience decreases, and something called our window of tolerance, which is our capacity to tolerate activation or stress in our body, feeling a little bit overwhelmed or at a lower limit, the bottom of our window of tolerance, our ability to tolerate feeling, bored, tuned out, vague, and tired, that window really shrinks. And as soon as we go out of that window, we're in something called survival mode. So at the top, hyperarousal, too much, stress, panic, anxiety. Then we go into fight and flight, which you might be familiar with. And our cortex, right? And our cortex, which is our thinking brain, it shuts off. Suddenly we're making decisions based on avoiding pain or helping ourselves survive and conserve resources in whatever way, shape, or form that we can. Same for the bottom. Underneath our window of tolerance, if we've gone into hypoarousal, which is more likely if there's nothing that we can do to outrun the threat or fight off the threat, a la fight and flight, we're just going to say, right, just going to shut down, going to dissociate, disconnect from myself and what's going on around me, and kind of go into a bit of a hibernation and flop on the couch and watch Netflix.
The longer the pandemic goes on for Magdalena, is it more and more likely that people are going to be moving into that state? So I guess initially when the pandemic kicked in, we were all trying to find ways to deal with it. We had these elevated states, our cortisol increased, but in a useful way at the beginning. And now we're not necessarily having those same responses. Is that just because of that cumulative effect of the stress?
Definitely. So, at the beginning, people were like, right, just going to get through this, going to learn a language, going to get super ripped, going to have weekly socials on Zoom or whatever with my friends. But now as we're at lockdown 6.0, it doesn't look like things are going to be changing anytime soon. And we run out of resources and steam really quickly. So we're just going to go into our cocoon. And if we're in a survival mode, we're not thinking. So that means it's all about gratification. We're not able to connect with the consequences of our behavior. And we might not even want to, because it's about really trying to avoid those uncomfortable emotional experiences of anger, grief, fear that might be happening because of what's going on with the pandemic.
Definitely saw a decrease in Instagram posts where they were like, what are you learning in this new lockdown? how are you using your time? And now it's just gone on the downward spiral, and now I don't see any of those anymore.
Yeah.
Chugging along.
It's like trying to remain proactive when everything in your body is telling you that it's not going to work. Becomes really, really difficult. So, that, as you mentioned before about allostatic load, we can look at allostatic load from so many different positions, but allostasis is what we're aiming for, right? So allostasis is where we produce a stress response, but it's, balanced with the stressor itself, and our body is capable of using that stress response and then going back into balance really quickly afterwards. Allostatic load, on the other hand, is when we've got so much load that we can't go back into allostasis. We can't get that balance back whilst all of that's still going on around us, which puts us in a situation where not only is a lot of what's going on out of our control, we then don't even know how to manage the stuff that is within our control. It's really interesting, isn't it, how our stress responses work?
Absolutely. The process of getting back to allostasis is through learning to manage your stress, but also regulate your emotions. So you can have ups, but not going up into that fight and flight level. And you can have your downs without fully shutting down, dissociating and going into hibernation, so that the swings end up looking more like this.
Even though you're having, the waves, you're still in control. It's not erratic behavior or anything like that. Like, have you found that, obviously with the highs and lows, and obviously people reacting in the moment in that fight or flight mode, have you seen that there's been an increase in people, having distorted eating in terms of emotional eating and stress eating, or the opposite effect?
Absolutely. And I think we can differentiate between eating disorders and disordered eating. Everyone who has a disorder will have some kind of disordered eating, but people who show disordered eating don't necessarily have an eating disorder. And depending, there are so many different types of eating disordered behaviors, but the more common ones that we might be seeing are, eating restriction, binge eating, emotional eating, or, those overcompensatory types of behaviors like purging or over-exercising. And depending on someone's temperament, but also at the individual level, depending on how they've learned it's acceptable for us to manage and respond to our emotions, perhaps what we saw happening within our families, for example, then we might choose to engage in any one of those types of disordered eating behaviors. But with the restriction, I notice that happening more in people who are over-regulated, so who really value control and order within their life, more sort of type A sorts of personalities who have come from families where you must be perfect in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
So they're phobic of their emotions. They don't want to surrender to those impulses. And so they'll engage in those kinds of restriction behaviors to feel okay, like their sense of self is still intact. I'm a worthwhile person. I can manage this in spite of the fact everything around me seems unmanageable. With impulse eating, it might be more the other way. So someone who has or is underregulated essentially. So they might come from families where they weren't necessarily modeled good emotion regulation behaviors, that people were just free and easy and discharging, that pent up emotional energy around them. And so they surrender to the impulse or the feeling. They'll probably dissociate when they're trying to get rid of that uncomfortable feeling or impulse by, standing over the counter, tuning out and kind of getting as much food in as possible, or they might be binge eating while they're also doing something else like playing a game or watching a movie or having, alcohol or other types of drugs. So they're not fully present for the experience, but they're able to alleviate that uncomfortable feeling by having a strong sort of sensory input and all those good endorphins that come from eating not so great foods or in not so great quantities for us.
So I guess that's where food environment would play a massive role nowadays that it didn't back in the day. So with food being so accessible nowadays, particularly Uber Eats, those sorts of things, they're available anywhere, anytime, anyhow. So your immediate food environment is not the only environment that's playing in on you now, I guess. So whereas back in the day, it would only really have been what your family did that affected your food choices. Now the broader world is affecting your food choices as well. And then in that kind of a state, having so many options available, I guess, just gives you more opportunity to move in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. It's super duper convenient and you can do it sort of privately.
That's very true, actually. So one of the things I talk to a lot of my clients about is when they're eating, if they are eating alone and hiding away whilst they're eating, there's usually something underlying that, some sort of shame or fear that underlies it. And trying to get to the bottom of that can be really challenging for people because they don't, probably for the reasons you were saying just before, actually, they're detached from it whilst they're doing it. So they don't actually recognize that that's a problem in the first place. So when you first bring it to their attention, that that's not necessarily a useful behavior, they're very confronted by it. And it's difficult for them to then want to do something about it because then they have to admit that they do that and follow the process that goes along.
Exactly right. To confront ourselves. It's easy to lie.
Much easier, hey? Much easier.
It's easy to just not accept that you're doing anything wrong, because as soon as you're aware of it, then you have to make a decision whether you continue it and you choose it or you change it.
Yeah, that's it. We also, we see study after study in the nutritional health world that shows that the vast majority of people can actually lose weight effectively, right? But comparatively, the number of people who are actually able to keep weight off is relatively small. In your opinion, does this mean that we need to start looking more at strategies that combine psychology and nutrition rather than just nutritional education? Because the vast majority of the population, we've got more access to information about food than ever before, but the obesity epidemic is worse than ever before. So it doesn't feel to me like it's a lack of education. The more and more I look into it, the more and more I see this need for the psychological side of food choices, decision fatigue, all of that sort of jazz to be taken into account when we treat people for nutritional issues, particularly people who are overweight. but there's not much of a push for it. So people don't associate being overweight with psychology. They associate being overweight with seeing a personal trainer or a nutritionist, but they don't really associate it with psychology. But if psychology is the limiting factor, if not understanding why you're making the decisions that you're making is what's stopping you from getting long-term progress and being able to successfully lose weight and keep it off, do you think that there's an angle that we should be pushing? Do you think that there's a collaborative opportunity for nutritionists to work with psychologists? I mean, I know I refer clients to you, Magdalena, and health psychs that you've recommended. But what do you think would be the best approach to kind of get that all connected?
Yeah, health is multi-dimensional, and to address one facet of that in isolation is to kind of cut yourself off at the knees. I think it always needs to be integrated if you want the change to be lasting. And you can teach people skills and educate them until you're blue in the face, but unless they have a clear sense of why this change is meaningful to them, how it's going to add value to their life, and not just because, their doctor said that they need to lose weight, or their partner said that, they would prefer a certain body type, or, the industry that they work in would prefer if they looked a certain way. If they're not personally connected to that, then it's not going to fly for very long, because if your behavior is driven by fear and avoidance of a negative outcome, then you're in survival mode again. So you're not in your window of tolerance. And you're not going to be able to connect to that, once you've achieved your goal. For instance, you've lost 40 kilos and, the world was applauding you and you're like, oh, excellent, well done. But now you've got no sense of what your life is actually going to look like, because your whole life has been, the decision since you made the choice to lose the weight, for example, has just been getting to that point with no sense of constructing what you want your reality to look like following that, and why that's important to you.
Yeah, that's
I think sorry.
No, go for it, Dak.
I think the approach of some coaches that I've seen, hopefully majority of them, I think a lot of them have put a lot more effort into like what comes after, which I think is amazing. Like, I think, look back 5 or 10 years ago and it was just kind of get to the goal, take the photos, and you're on your way. Good luck with what you've done. See you later. And I think the approach is definitely changing. Like you said, it has to, I guess, to work as well.
I think the bodybuilding industry is probably one of the examples where that hasn't really changed a huge amount, where when you're going into that industry, you are so focused on a subjective, like at the end of the day, you're working on your physical appearance so that you can stand up on stage and have people subjectively decide whether or not you're the best person up there or not. And then you become almost completely reliant on that feedback to stay of value, because it becomes who you are rather than what you do. So it's probably a really good example of where that system is not working. Even when I used to work as a bodybuilding coach, I had a psychologist come out and talk to my guys post-comp, because I couldn't give my girls, or boys and girls, what they needed to move forward in their lives after competition, because they couldn't see themselves the same way as they were able to beforehand. Their value changed based on the fact that they were now a competitor. I wonder if there's, I don't know, even after I got the psychologist to come out and talk to my girls, it was very difficult to get them back into a headspace where we could teach them that they had more value than just their body. So how you were mentioning before, Magdalena, about people in a certain industry might feel more of a need to have that certain physique, and therefore the outcome that they're chasing isn't for them. It's, it's external to that. How would we go about maybe talking to people to get them to start moving on a different pathway? How would we start a conversation like that with someone to get them to recognize that they might need to look at it from a different avenue?
I think if you're suspecting that's what's going on, then the best approach is just to have an open and frank conversation with them about it. And I think the temptation, I know it's something that I've certainly felt at times, is to try and hold, the responsibility and accountability for your client's outcome, to locate that within yourself as the healthcare practitioner when it belongs with them. And, if they're engaging on a journey that you can sense is probably for reasons that are about fear, or are about avoidance, or are just to achieve something sort of quick and short term, then, reflect the risks and, invite them to do that work for themselves. And they could just laugh in your face and say, thanks, okay, but, ultimately that's with them.
That's right. Yeah. At least you've done your bit.
I feel when I always, not always, but I always kind of tell clients like, oh, maybe you should, who are struggling with sleep, to like, maybe you should meditate. And I always feel a bit silly telling people to meditate, because it's like, oh, it's a bit dicky, but like, I mean, everyone's on board for it. I mean, I personally don't meditate, but I can see the value in it. But every time I like suggest it, like maybe you just do some light meditation, and I always feel like a dick. Like I mean, some things sound really fancy and fairy, but like that mental side of stuff, like it has to be, and it works. Like you got to put the effort in, even some of the things that you don't see the value in work for others.
Pardon the terminology, but all the hippy dippy shit, I think, is what we're going
exactly,
for, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's funny because it only seems hippy dippy until you apply it and it works, and then it doesn't seem so hippy dippy anymore.
It's interesting, sometimes I even think some clients can go through the motions of engaging, with professionals like yourself and myself to get taught, the things that they most likely might already have an inkling they need to be doing. But if they're coming to the appointment and, getting handed the skills and being made the suggestions, then that's kind of like doing the work without really doing the work sometimes too. It can be a way to, avoid really thinking within yourself, what's in the way of me taking control and initiative, and ownership of my own health behavior change, because I can place that, with the person in front of me, and they'll tell me about mindfulness, which, I know isn't for me for the 10th time, because, it's everywhere at the moment. But
I love it. Well, there's a lot of research currently being done on the relationship between physical health and mental health. And of course, it's been interesting from in the pandemic, gyms have been closed down for the vast majority of the pandemic. Every gym owner, every personal trainer has been pushing this side of physical health leads to improved mental health. Can you give us a little bit of a rundown, Magdalena, about why that's so? Why does physical health or, exercise lead to such amazing improvements in mental health?
I mean, there are so many benefits. And I think that health, like we mentioned before, it's multidimensional and it's holistic. So if you're doing right by your body, likelihood is you're going to be doing right by your mind. You can't really separate the two, but I mean, broadly, I think it's really helpful in supporting your mental health because it regulates so many of your basic and core physiological processes, your sleep, your metabolism, your hormone profile. It helps you to complete your stress response and get back to allostasis, like we talked about before, so that you're constantly widening your capacity to take on, more stresses and deal with them. Makes you more resilient. But then at the identity level, it's going to be helpful for you because you're showing yourself that you are disciplined, not in that, you're Mr. Commando or whatever, but hey, I can trust myself. I can rely on myself to look after my body and be a steward of my body. I'm showing myself that I'm worthwhile and I have value through demonstrating, that I'm going to care for myself in this way. Exercise, whatever movement feels right for you.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think everyone knows it. Everyone feels these things without actually realizing what they're feeling, don't they? Like, you walk into a session and you may really not want to train. Like, you turn up, you're dragging your feet, 5 minutes in, all of a sudden you've done a complete 180, you know, all of a sudden you're excited about training, you're feeling good about the fact that you're doing something good for yourself. And then you walk away with a sense of achievement, the extra endorphins. Like you were mentioning before, sex hormones, people don't realize, you know, your sex hormones affect your serotonin, and your serotonin affects how happy you are. You know, we always we have a weird ability as humans to kind of separate all of these topics. So we don't think that the adrenals are dependent on the sex hormones. We don't think the sex hormones are dependent on the thyroid, We separate it all out. We don't realize that it's all working as a team within us, guys. We need to keep everything healthy. We need to be very aware of everything. And the adrenals play a role so high up in the hierarchy, don't they, Magdalena? Like, they send such significant messages, and they can be a significant limiting factor in all of those other aspects. I've been doing some research on post-traumatic stress disorder lately, and I had no idea how significant the impact of post-traumatic stress was on the adrenals, and the long-term damage that it can cause, those sorts of things. It's just really interesting to see that there's this aspect of our life, this allostatic load, that we do actually have the power to affect, that then has the power to affect so many other things that come after it. It's just crazy, absolutely crazy.
When people with trauma or post-traumatic stress, you know, their allostatic load is constantly much higher than everybody else's, and their window of tolerance is going to be much slimmer, only because they're in a constant state of survival. That's what post-traumatic stress is, the inability to leave that state of survival, even if you're in a state of safety.
It's a hard thing to think about, really, isn't it? You don't ever want to think that anyone you know is going through something like that, because it's hard enough to deal with stress in the normal state. All right, Dak, what else did we have on the list for Lena today?
All right, we have some questions from the public. Question 1, how does the mental stress impact your training performance? I would like to say a lot.
Yes, I think that Dak and Lan can definitely give you a better rundown on the physical impact of stress on your training more than I could. But psychologically speaking, everything that we spoke about just before, if you're stressed, you're not in your window of tolerance, your cortex, your thinking brain is not available to you, you're making decisions based on short-term avoidance of discomfort and gratification, and about conserving your resources and surviving. You're not really connected to your values, or really connected to the consequences of you not doing the things that you already understand are going to be good for you in the long term. So it's just going to derail your capacity to mindfully engage in a behavior that normally you would be happy to and able to.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Me and Dak have had way too much fun chatting with you, Lena, and we've only got a couple of minutes left before we're going to get cut off. So I'm going to run the very last question from one of our viewers. Why am I more likely to make bad food decisions when I am tired or when I'm bored?
People hate feeling the emotion of boredom. It's not a fun emotion to feel or tolerate. And most of us have learned throughout our life that it's something that we should actively attempt to avoid, that it might be a sign of a failure, you know, in our life, that we're not doing things right, that it's not okay to feel this way. And so naturally, we're going to want to do something more exciting, more novel, to get away from the discomfort. So there's that, just the avoidance of an uncomfortable emotional state. But if you're tired, or if you are bored and that's sending you out of your window of tolerance, then what we talked about before, your decision-making capacity is going to be pretty impaired. And so you're going to be, well, operating as though you were chronically drunk. Just think about it that way. You know, if you're fatigued, it's like you're drunk. If you're stressed, it's like you're making decisions like you are drunk, because your thinking brain is not working
It's dangerous.
Yeah, we've all experienced that. Magdalena, we are so grateful that we were able to get you on today. It's been an absolute joy having you. You're always a pleasure to be around, but we know that our viewers are going to take a lot out of this. So I'm just going to plug you one more time. Magdalena Mills, Curious Mind Psychology in Footscray. Hit her up, guys. She is absolutely amazing. Thank you again for coming on. Dak, did you have anything you wanted to say?
No, that's it. We got time is of the essence. We've only got a few minutes left. No, thank you for coming on. Like, it's been really insightful, and hopefully we'll be able to have you on again in the future to go through probably the same stuff all over again, I reckon.
Yeah, that would be lovely. Thanks so much for having me. And I just want to quickly add, if anything that we've touched on today has been triggering in any way, shape or form, then I'll send Dak and Lan a little list of resources for you to help regulate yourself back, and a list of contacts for you to get in touch should you need any further support.
You are amazing. Thanks again, Magdalena. Guys, if you're watching at home, drop any questions, comments below, and we will get back to you ASAP.
Everyone, thank you again. you.